Right, hello and welcome back. Before we take a look at the list collection data type, I want us to take a look at a convenient method for creating tuples, which allows us to access individual items of the tuple by name instead of indices or tuple unpacking like we stated earlier. And to do that, we need to be able to import a module known as collections. There is a package in Python known as collections that have code written for us to be able to do what we want to do. So I'm going to use an example to do that. So let's say we want to create a tuple that represent a person. Okay, the first thing we need to do is we need to import collections, because that is where the functionality for creating a named tuple comes from, and we are going to learn about how to use named tuples. And so I'm working in a file called named tuples. Okay, the way you do that after you've imported your collection is you first of all declare a type that you'll be using. So we're going to call that person, okay? And then you say is equal to collections.named tuple. And the first thing you bring is how you want your tuple to be called. Usually it needs to match the name of the type that you created here. So person and then person, okay? And then the next argument that you give to the named tuple function is you give it a list. We haven't studied about list yet, but a list is just another collection that is delimited by square brackets, okay? So inside the person record, I want to be able to store your first name. Look at it, these are strings. So last name, I'm going to call that L name, and we also want to be able to get your age, okay? Something like this. So now that we have created this named tuple, we can create values of it and store it in some variables. So let's create cyberpunk. So I'm going to say cyberpunk is equal to person, okay? And then the first name for cyberpunk is Edward, the last name is Pi, and the age is, let's say, 78, okay? So over here I can use the printf statement, the f strings, to print, let's say, first name. So the first name, I can get that by saying cyberpunk dot f name. You see, now I'm able to retrieve the individual items in the tuple, not with indices, neither am I using tuple unpacking here, but now I have been able to assign names to the individual items in the tuple and I'm using them, okay? So over here, I can say last name. Sorry, it has to all be in here. All right, so I can say last name, and for the last name I'm going to do cyberpunk dot l name, and I can also print the age if I want. So I'll say age, and that is going to be cyberpunk dot age, okay? And then I am going to run this program. So python 3 named tuples.py, and you can see that indeed the first name is Edward, the last name is Pi, and the age is 78, as we did in here. Just in case you don't understand, I'm going to go over again to help you understand it. So what we want to do here is to create a tuple, just as any other tuple we have learned about so far. But in this case, we want to be able to access the individual items of the tuple by names that we assign to those items, and not just indices like specifying 0, 1, 2. I mean, it's not the coolest way to access items from a tuple. And we also don't want to use tuple unpacking, which we have learned about. So Python makes it possible to create something known as a named tuple, and that functionality is available from the collections package, which is part of the Python standard library. So somewhere on your file system there is a folder that contains everything we need to do what we are doing. Okay, the next thing you do is you call a function called named tuple on the collections package, and then you have to first of all create a variable which is actually kind of a type or a blueprint you are creating that will be used to construct other values, okay, for that particular tuple type. And so you give it a name, which is usually going to match what you specify here. And then in square bracket, you list what is known as the attribute or the names you want to assign to the individual items of that tuple. Once you have this, you can now use the person as a type to create instances. I mean, I'm going ahead of myself here, so don't worry if you do not understand it. I just want you to be aware of a better way of creating tuples. Okay, so you call the person type that you created and you pass in values that correspond to the individual attributes or the items that will be in the tuple, and from that point on you can use the dot notation to access the individual items. Once again, don't worry if you don't understand everything about this, and I promise you that once we begin to take a look at object-oriented programming, everything that is happening here will make sense to you. So let's take a quick break and I'll see you in the next video where we start talking about the list data type.